You didn't stop asking all at once. It happened slowly. At first, you still asked small things, clarifications, simple questions. Nothing heavy, nothing personal. Just normal moments where you needed a bit more information. Each time you asked, something small followed. A pause, a look, a breath that felt different. Not dramatic, just enough to notice. No one said you were wrong. No one told you to stop. But the air shifted anyway. You told yourself it was nothing. People get distracted. People are busy. Not every question lands the same. You kept asking for a while. Then you started noticing your own hesitation. The moment before a question left your mouth, the quick scan of the room, the silent check. Is this the right time? Is this worth it? Sometimes you asked anyway. Sometimes you didn't. You noticed how often you chose not to, not because you didn't care, because it felt easier. Easier than the pause, easier than the look, easier than the quiet feeling that you had disrupted something. You started answering your own questions instead. You guessed, you filled in gaps. You told yourself you didn't really need to know. You were usually right anyway. From the outside, you looked relaxed, easygoing, someone who went with the flow, someone who didn't make things complicated. Inside, you were doing constant calculations. What to ask, what to leave alone, what might make things awkward, what might cost you something later. You didn't think of this as silence. You thought of it as being considerate, as not wanting to bother anyone, as being low maintenance. It felt reasonable. It even felt mature. But something had shifted. You were still curious, still thoughtful, still aware. You just kept more of it to yourself. And without naming it, you had started choosing not to ask. You began to see it clearly. Not all at once, over time. You would think of a question and feel a small resistance before it reached your lips. A pause inside you, a quiet check. You noticed it happening again and again. You watched how people reacted when you did ask. Sometimes they answered quickly. Sometimes they sighed first. Sometimes they smiled, but it felt thin. Sometimes they made a joke instead of answering. Sometimes they looked away. Nothing was said directly. That was the strange part. No one told you to stop. No one said your questions were wrong. But the reactions carried something. You felt it even when you couldn't explain it. You noticed which questions felt welcome. The practical ones, the light ones, the kind that didn't slow anything down. And you noticed which ones didn't. The ones that asked for clarity, the ones that asked for reasons, the ones that touched on feelings or decisions. Your body learned before your mind did. A slight tightening in your chest, a small drop in your stomach, a sense that this might not go well. You couldn't always say why, you just knew. You started to predict the responses. You knew when someone would brush it off. You knew when they would change the subject. You knew when they would act like it should have been obvious. So you began to pause longer before asking. You weighed the question. You measured the room. You asked yourself if it was really necessary. Sometimes you decided it was, sometimes you didn't. More often than not, you stayed quiet. No one noticed the questions you swallowed. No one commented on your silence. From the outside, nothing looked different. But inside, you were learning a rule. Some questions were safe, others came with a cost. And you were learning that rule without anyone teaching you. The same pattern kept coming back. You would think of a question. You would feel that pause. You would hesitate. Sometimes you asked anyway, sometimes you didn't. And every time, you noticed what followed. When you asked the easy questions, things stayed light. The moment moved on. No tension, no shift. You felt fine. When you asked the deeper ones, the room changed. Not loudly, just enough to feel it. A slower response, a different tone. a sense that you had stepped into something heavier. You noticed how often your questions were answered halfway, not directly, with side comments, with distractions, with jokes. You got something, but not what you had asked. You started to recognize that feeling, the one where you wished you hadn't spoken. Not because you were wrong, because you could feel the weight your question had added. It happened often enough that you stopped calling it coincidence. You didn't make a big story about it. You just adjusted. You noticed how others asked questions, how they kept them light, how they laughed first, how they made it sound casual. You watched the way they softened everything before it landed. You tried doing the same. You added a smile. You downplayed your curiosity. You framed things as small, even when they weren't. It worked sometimes. The reaction stayed neutral. The room didn't shift as much. So you kept doing it. You weren't trying to change who you were. You were just trying to keep things smooth, to avoid that quiet discomfort that followed certain questions. And slowly, asking stopped feeling simple. It started feeling like a choice you had to measure every time. You started changing how you asked, not the questions themselves, the way you brought them in. You added soft words first. Just wondering, probably silly. This might not matter. You tried to make the question smaller before it landed. You wanted it to feel light, harmless, easy to brush past if needed. You learned to wait for the right moment. You watched for good moods, for calm spaces, for times when people seemed open. You told yourself timing mattered. You noticed how often you held a question for too long. You waited. The moment passed. You waited again. Sometimes the conversation ended before you ever asked. You told yourself it was fine, that it wasn't urgent, that you didn't really need to know. But you did. You just didn't want to deal with what followed. You became good at reading rooms. You picked up on small cues, a tight smile, a short reply, a quick subject change. You adjusted in real time. You learned to drop questions halfway through, to laugh and move on, to pretend you were just thinking out loud. People seemed more comfortable that way. The mood stayed lighter, things flowed. So you kept doing it. You didn't think of this as changing yourself. You thought of it as being flexible, socially aware, easy to be around. But over time, it stopped feeling like a choice. It felt like a habit you didn't remember choosing. And you kept asking less. Living this way began to change how you felt inside conversations. You noticed how often you stayed quiet, even when something mattered to you. Not because you didn't care, because you didn't want to deal with what asking would bring. You felt the work of it, the thinking ahead, the scanning, the small calculation before every question. You weighed the moment. You weighed the person. You weighed the possible reactions, all before you said a word. You started carrying your questions with you instead. You answered them alone. You guessed. You filled in the gaps. Sometimes you were right. Sometimes you weren't. But at least you avoided the pause. At least you avoided the shift. Over time, this created distance, not from others, from your own curiosity. You used to ask freely. Now you filtered. You held back. You decided what was worth the cost. You noticed how often you left conversations feeling unfinished, like something had stayed behind, something that never made it into the room. You told yourself it was fine, that you didn't need to know everything, that you were being mature, understanding, low maintenance. But you felt a quiet frustration, a dull ache of not being heard even when you hadn't spoken. You realized you were silencing yourself before anyone else could. Nothing dramatic happened. No one shut you down. No one told you to stop asking. Still, something had shifted. You were still thinking, still noticing, still wondering. You just kept it all inside. And you hadn't named what that was costing you. There was one thing you eventually noticed. You didn't stop asking because you had no questions. You stopped because it felt easier not to. Easier than watching the room change. Easier than carrying that quiet feeling afterward. Easier than wondering if you had crossed some invisible line again. You hadn't been told to stay quiet. No one said you were too much. No rule was named. But you learned it anyway. You learned it from pauses that lasted too long, from looks that didn't match the words, from the way moments cooled after certain questions. Over time, it became automatic. You filtered your curiosity before it reached your mouth. You softened questions in your head. You turned them into something lighter, something safer, something that wouldn't slow things down. You weren't unsure of what you wanted to ask. You were unsure of what it would cost. You had learned that some questions changed the air. Some questions asked for more than people wanted to give. And you didn't always want to carry that weight. So you chose the smoother path. You chose silence over tension, guessing over asking, keeping things moving instead of slowing them down. No one asked you to do this. You adapted on your own. You learned what felt safer, what kept things calm, what didn't create that quiet discomfort. And slowly, without meaning to, you stopped reaching for clarity. Not because it didn't matter, because it had started to feel risky. Then the truth settled. It wasn't that you didn't care anymore. It was that asking had begun to feel like something you had to pay for. When it felt easier not to ask,